Welcome to the National Council of Resistance of Iran, U.S. Representative Office. My name is Alireza Jafarzadeh, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Washington office of the NCRI. On our panel today, we're going to discuss the threat coming from the Iranian regime and how to deal with it. But before I introduce the distinguished panelists who are joining me today, I want to mention that this event is broadcast live on our website on www.ncri-US.org. It's also broadcast on some of our social media platforms, on Twitter and on YouTube. That's at NCRI-US. I repeat, at NCRI-US, broadcast live streamed on our Twitter account and our YouTube. What I will do, I will ask all the panel members to make their opening remarks. But before that, I'd like to introduce the panel to you. First, we are very honored to have Honorable John Rood, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy until recently. He also served in various positions within the US government, and we're very honored to have him, Mr. Rood. Thank you so much for coming. We also have Ambassador Robert Joseph, who was the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. He too served in various positions within the White House, at the State Department, and other places. Thank you, Ambassador Joseph, for joining us. We're also joined today by Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, who was the director of the Counterproliferation Center. He was also a special advisor to the director of the National Intelligence. He's been dealing with rogue states for years, and we're delighted to have Ambassador DeTrani today. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Oli Heinonen, who was the Deputy Secretary General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and he worked in the agency for 27 years. He was also the head of the Department of the Safeguards. He is now Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center. Thank you all for joining today. But first, I want to say a few words myself. You know, the world is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's no exception in the case of Iran. But there is a big difference. Everywhere else, the governments are united with the people to fight the COVID-19. In the case of Iran, the regime is united with the COVID-19 to fight the people. And that explains, I think, all the misery that has come, the high number of casualties, the cover-ups, and how the regime is viewing the COVID-19, perhaps as an opportunity to exploit, to put a damp or cover the uprising and the discontent of the population that's been there for months and months and months, and also use that as an opportunity to see if they can get some concessions from the outside world. You know, they asked for the IMF $5 billion. They're hoping to lift the sanctions on the Iranian regime under the cover of the COVID-19. Of course, we played a big role, our movement, to expose the regime's real agenda, what's really happening on the ground. The regime doesn't provide any details, any information about the casualties, about those who've been infected. They always put just like one big general number, which is clearly fake and underestimated. Even the World Health Organization said those numbers, the real numbers are at least 5 times higher. We put out reports, books, almost every single day we have a report or statement out. Here's like just one example of a report that we put out earlier about the COVID-19, and we have a list of breakdown of each province where people have died, one by one in every single province we can see here. So in other words, what I'm saying is that really what the Iranian regime has done to take advantage of the COVID-19 is not working for them, because people see it as just like one additional reason to want to get rid of the Ayatollahs, because they saw the mismanagement, the cover-up, the corruption in the midst of that. Now, externally, the Iranian regime has stepped up its terror operations, continues to support the militias in the region, and it has a very ambitious nuclear weapons program, the missile program, and all the trouble they're causing in the region, which you're going to hear from the panel today, who are going to address those aspects. But what I want to emphasize now is that the view of the people of Iran is that none of these actions of the Iran regime externally is actually supported by the people. The people see all of these external rogue behavior of the Iran regime not just a threat to the international community, but a threat to the people of Iran, because the resources, the money, the manpower, the attention, instead of going to the healthcare, to education, to welfare system of the population, is now being all funneled to those mercenaries, foreign mercenaries around the world. Just think about it. The militias funded by the Iran regime in Syria are paid 5 times higher than the nurses in Iran. And just you know, that will hit everyone, that, you know, in terms of reality, in terms of the priority where the regime stands. So with that, I wanted to just say that, you know, when we talk about the external rogue behavior of the Iran regime, this is not just for the international community or a threat for the United States or others. It's detrimental to the people of Iran. And of course, when that threat is eliminated, the first and foremost beneficiary of that would be the people of Iran. Now, with that, I know you're waiting to hear from Undersecretary John Rood, who just left the administration in the beginning of March of this year. And he's been following the developments, monitoring the situation, the behavior of the Iran regime for decades. And he's very up to date. And I like to now turn to John to please give us an overview of what your read is about Iran and the threat coming from the Iran regime. John, please.
Well, thank you, Alireza, for the invitation to speak today, and especially amongst such a distinguished panel, and to have the opportunity to speak about the threat posed by Iran. And I think today the Iranian regime poses the greatest threat to the United States and our allies in the Middle East. The regime also remains the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. The ideology promoted by Ayatollah Khomeini, who came to power in the 1979 revolution, envisioned spreading that revolution across the region, and the supreme leader today remains committed to that vision. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see across the region and how that is occurring. But consistent with this vision, Iran has grown its influence across an arc stretching from Yemen to the Strait of Hormuz, through the Gulf, through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to the Palestinian territories. Throughout those areas, the regime has backed proxy militias with the goal of advancing Iranian-style Islamism. The combination of a desire to undermine governments in the region, spread the 1979 revolution, and to provide and utilize lethal conventional capabilities and proxy forces poses a persistent threat to us. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force leads these malign influence efforts and power projection through a complex network of state and non-state partners and militant proxies. Since the Arab Spring and the start of the Syrian civil war, the Iranian regime has become increasingly involved in regional conflicts, particularly in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Iran has committed extensive resources and deployed military forces to support key partners in these struggles, adapting its long-standing model of warfare in which it supported terrorist and proxy militant groups like Hezbollah to also include more conventional applications of conventional military power and involvement of IRGC forces directly. In Syria, since the early days of that civil war, Iran has been involved in propping up the Assad regime to include providing arms, training, advisors, and combat personnel to support the Syrian regime. Throughout the conflict, in which over 500,000 civilians have been killed, Iranian forces and support has played a key role in this appallingly brutal conflict that has included the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime against their own people. In Iraq, one of the Iranian regime's strongest levers of influence is through the many Shia militias it backs. Iran has provided financial backing for some of these groups for decades. The Badr organization, Asib al-Haq, Khatib Hezbollah have long served as reliable partners for the regime in Tehran, including conducting attacks on U.S. military personnel in Iraq from 2003 to 2011 using Iranian-provided munitions. Using these Iranian-provided weapons, these groups were responsible for over 600 U.S. personnel who were killed in Iraq between 2003 and 2011. I visited Iraq last year to meet with the Prime Minister in November, along with the Defense Minister and leaders of the Kurdistan Regional Government. And the corrosive impact of this Iranian malign influence was very apparent. Throughout Iraq, Shia militia groups challenged the authority of the government and suppressed the ability of the Iraqi people to determine their own future. The streets in Baghdad and other major cities had swelled with protesters calling for an independent Iraq with the ability to determine its own future without this malign influence from Iran. Elsewhere in the region, I'd say Iran has continued that same playbook, maintaining strong ties to the terrorist group Hezbollah in Lebanon, its most significant and oldest non-state partner, and a core member of what Tehran calls its axis of resistance. The regime also provides support, including training, funding, and military equipment to Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups. The Iranian regime provides support to Shia militants in Bahrain and the Taliban in Afghanistan. In Yemen, Iran has supported the Houthi rebels with financial assistance, weapons, military training, and operational advice. And Iran provides a wide range of support, including advisors, training, and lethal aid to the Houthis to support their operations against the Saudi-led coalition, including the UAE in the Yemen conflict. They've really just tried to fan the flames of that conflict, despite the suffering that you see going on in Yemen from the Yemeni people. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force is the IRGC's main external operations element and is Iran's primary conduit of support and guidance to these non-state partners and proxies. At the same time, I'm concerned that more modern conventional capabilities will be open to Iran for the first time since the revolution, as the UN arms embargo is scheduled to end in October of this year. These more modern arms are likely to fuel an increased adventurism by the regime as it continues to spread its malign influence. And in so many areas, as Alireza mentioned, the regime is not on the same page as the Iranian people, who do not support the regime as it tries to spread this malign influence across the region. As Eric Edelman and Ray Takei point out in their article on Iran in the current version of Foreign Affairs, quote, last November, a sudden increase in fuel prices provoked riots in hundreds of cities in Iran. Some 1,500 people died at the hands of the police and security forces. This time, the demonstrators did not just call for the death of their leaders. They also decried Iran's involvements in conflicts elsewhere, chanting, quote, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran. Leave Syria, think about us. Even as the regime condemned American imperialism, Iran's leaders always assumed their own projects would burnish their legitimacy, but it appears many Iranians no longer want to waste their resources on Arab civil wars, end quote. One of the things that, of course, has provided fuel for this growth in Iranian military support to proxies and involvement in conflicts in the region was the signing of the JCPOA in 2015, which lifted sanctions and returned large amounts of frozen Iranian funds to the regime. From 2015 to 2018, Iran's official defense budget grew by 40%, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency in their Iran Military Power Report of 2019. It's an unclassified report. That spending grew from 2015 to 2018 from $19.5 billion to $27.3 billion. Now, following the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 and the reimposition of U.S. oil and banking sanctions, the Defense Intelligence Agency reports the Iranian official defense budget decreased by 24% in 1 year in 2019 alone to $20.7 billion. And obviously, Iran's economy has been under further stress since that time, and we're likely to see that defense budget shrink. The defense budget is under that pressure because of the toll that the U.S. maximum pressure campaign continues to take on the Iranian economy, with unprecedented sanctions on the Iranian financial system and key sectors of the economy like oil, petrochemicals, and metals. I do worry that we're going to continue to see the potential for conflict emerging with Iran. Of course, in January, the simmering low-intensity conflict between the United States and Iranian-backed militias came to a boil when the United States conducted a strike that killed the leader of the IRGC Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, and Iran retaliated by launching scores of missiles at U.S. military bases in Iraq that injured 110 U.S. soldiers. This exchange was merely the culmination of a lot of smaller scale attacks and U.S. retaliation that had led the U.S. and Iran to the brink of a large scale conflict, one with the potential to engulf the Middle East. So in wrapping up, let me just say, what do we do about this situation? I think one thing that is important is to continue the maximum pressure campaign to deplete and limit the ability of the regime to export its malign influence across the region. It would be preferable if we saw a more multilateral approach, as most of those sanctions have been unilateral U.S. sanctions, and I think they'd gain greater impact and be more influential if they were multilateral. U.S. military forces need to continue to work with partners in the region to deter and, where necessary, take steps like the strike on Soleimani to restore deterrence where it has frayed. We also need to continue to buttress and restore America's relationships with our allies. During the Trump presidency, the U.S. has buttressed relationships with traditional allies like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar that were strained during President Obama's tenure. A more confrontational approach to Iran during the Trump administration, as contrasted with the Obama administration's conciliatory approach, has been one of the things that has fueled that renewed closeness. During extensive travel throughout the Middle East and work to rebuild tattered relationships, I heard from leaders repeatedly about how long-standing close relations with the U.S. had been severely strained by the Obama administration's outreach and the existential threat that these states felt from the growth in Iran's influence. They praised the U.S. for steps like the Soleimani strike and crippling sanctions on Iran. But working with allies is also key to preserving free movement through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has built swarms of small boats, a large inventory of naval mines, and an arsenal of anti-ship missiles that can disrupt maritime traffic in this strategic choke point that is critical to global trade. The US-led international maritime security construct has successfully deterred Iranian aggression since it was stood up last year following Iran's seizure of a British ship. And just in wrapping up, let me also say, we also have to have the right kind of capabilities in our military to deter and deal with Iranian capabilities. I know Joe DeTrani is going to talk about Iran's missile capabilities. Having sufficient advanced missile defense systems is really key. After all, Iran is not investing in an advanced air force to challenge the United States and others in the region, but rather they're investing heavily in missiles. It's noteworthy that this is the way of all the capabilities the Iranian regime possesses. This is the way that its leaders chose to retaliate for the Soleimani strike in January, launching scores of missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq. And the same is true for advanced cyber capabilities that Iran is developing that we need to have the capability to counter. And lastly, we should be open to the opportunity for diplomacy given the immense pressure on the Iranian government. But we've got to be realistic. While that pressure may well generate a diplomatic opening that we should seize upon, it may be necessary for the United States and our partners to undermine the regime for years before it eventually falls if the regime does not eventually show a willingness to support a negotiated settlement. So with that brief overview, let me again thank Alireza for inviting me to participate, and thank you for putting me on such a distinguished panel here today. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much, John. You gave a very impressive overview of covering most of the aspects of the rogue behavior of the Iranian regime when it comes to the region, their support for the militias in the region, their missile program, and how the regime has continued to up the ante. And you also talked about the partnership with those who want to see a different Iran. And of course, the best partner would be the people of Iran, as you alluded to that in your remarks. Those are the ones who've been in the streets chanting death to the Ayatollahs and wanting change. And you also highlighted that the maximum pressure policy of the US is working, and that needs to be maintained. I'm sure there are a lot of other things that I see there are journalists who have already signed in a register. They will definitely have lots of questions for you later on. Now, let me turn to another aspect of the threat of the Iranian regime, which is very significant, and that's the nuclear weapons program of the Ayatollahs. And the best person that can really give us the latest assessment on that is Dr. Oli Heinonen. And as I said, you know, he's been with the agency for 27 years. When we first exposed the nuclear sites in Natanz and Iraq on August 14, 2002, it was Oli who immediately wrote a letter requesting to visit, to have access to those sites, I guess, on the same day. And when the first delegation went to Iran, make no mistake, Oli was right there. So, Oli, please share your thoughts with us about the nuclear weapons program of Iran, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to this distinguished panel. So, where are we now with regard of the implementation of the JCPOA? In next 2 days, the IAEA will issue its quarterly report on the implementation of the JCPOA, as well as implementation of the safeguards agreement, comprehensive safeguards agreement, which Iran has concluded with the IAEA. So there will be 2 reports. And those reports will be debated in the meeting of the IAEA Board of Governors, which starts on June 15. But there will be also another report of interest. And this is the report by the facilitator of the UN Security Council. The report is due by 23rd of June, and the Council will debate it on the 30th of June. And this report will also include other aspects of the JCPOA and undertakings of Iran, such as any embargoes related to arms transfers, missile tests, and ballistic missile development. But let me start from the IAEA report. The report in March, both reports, JCPOA and the safeguards report, they both showed that Iran is in breach of its obligations under those agreements. Under the JCPOA, as we know, when the US withdrew last year, Iran said that it's not going to anymore withdrew 2 years ago. Iran said a year ago that it will not honor anymore all of its commitments and has gradually boosted its uranium enrichment capabilities. The March report showed that Iran has not only increased the number of centrifuges, but produced about 1 ton of low-enriched uranium, enriched up to 4.5%. This amount is actually enough to make 1 nuclear device if Iran wants to enrich it further to the level of 90%. The upcoming report, after 2 to 3 months of work, will show most likely that Iran has now a stock of enriched uranium, low enriched uranium, which is sufficient for 2 to 3 nuclear weapons. At the same time, Iran has installed additional centrifuges, is testing new models of centrifuges. Perhaps we should not be overly excited about the testing of IR 7s, 8s, and 9s, because it will take several years before those can be fielded. But what is the matter of concern is the stock of IR 2 and IR 4 centrifuges which Iran has. It has probably thousands of them, or can assemble thousands of them. If you take just those 2,000 IR2Ms, which were installed in 2015 when the JCPOA was concluded, under the JCPOA, Iran had to dismantle those, and that took place. But they can be put quickly back. Those centrifuges are 4 times more powerful than the IR1. So those 2,000 centrifuges, if installed, will double the Iranian enrichment capacity. And at the same time, it will bring out the breakout time, the time what it takes to produce highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapon from this 5% or 4.5% enriched uranium stock to half. It will be only perhaps 2-3 months. And this is certainly a matter of concern to the international community. The other things which are of concern are related to these atomic archives, which were revealed in 2018. This material, which was presented to the IAEA, I have also had an opportunity to study some of it, really gives indication that Iran has not really dismantled its nuclear weapons-related R&D. Why? First of all, why to keep those documents stored in that warehouse in Tehran? The second thing, what happened with this equipment which was brought to Turkuzabad, which also showed some contamination of natural uranium particles, which is indication that there might be some undeclared nuclear material in Iran. If that is the case, and the IAEA has been pursuing it vigorously for more than 1 year, and Iran has not provided access to those equipment or provided any plausible explanation for the contamination. This means in 2 ways that Iran is in non-compliance with its comprehensive safeguards agreement, which it has concluded under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, namely doesn't provide the access to the locations upon the request of the IAEA. IAEA has that access right under the additional protocol and has not, and at the same time, Iran is most likely having undeclared uranium in its possession. So these are serious things, and IAEA board is now meeting in 1.5 week time, and it's really time for the board to take a decisive action to bring Iran back to the compliance. Then Security Council will deal some of the other aspects which are not related directly to the nuclear, namely the missile and the arms embargo, but I leave those things for the other participants. But it appears to me that also in that area, Iran might be in breach of its obligations. So now international community is having 2 important meetings. This could be a threshold or where international community has to decide whether to go harder to get Iran into compliance and have a diplomatic approach which will really make it clear for Iran that this cannot be continuing. Why this is also important? As Mr. Jafarzadeh said, the Iranian non-compliance was exposed in 2002 August for the first time. Since then, since that date, there is no one day that Iran has been in full compliance with its nuclear obligations under the NPT Safeguards Agreement. I don't think that the international verification regime should tolerate such a behavior. And it's also in the interest of Iran. I don't think it's in the interest of Iran if the IAEA is not allowed to do its proper job in its neighboring countries. So I finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oli, for such a very comprehensive overview about the nuclear weapons program of the Iranian regime. I think it's very important when Oli, who's been following the developments, who has visited Iran, I don't know how many times, but perhaps more than any other IAEA specialist, he knows the issue. And when he says that since 2002, when we the nuclear sites in Natanz and Iraq, the Iranian regime has not been in compliance with its NPT obligations, not even for a single day. That's a very, very important statement to make, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions coming back later from the journalists and others. Now, I would like to go to our next fellow panelist, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Joe, you've been, dealing with lots of rogue regimes over the years, including North Korea, Iran. What's so different about Iran?
Thank you, Alireza. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with indeed all of you, certainly this distinguished panel. But let me just say, I spent a few years in Tehran at the American Embassy before 1979. I got to know the Iranian people, and I like the Iranian people. They are, and the history, the culture of the country is so rich. I must say this, it's so sad to see what's going on with COVID-19. Alireza, you mentioned that in the beginning, and we see this in the press, what's happening to the people on that issue. And our sympathy goes out, and hopefully the regime will work harder to protect the people. But let me talk a little about some of the issues we're here to discuss today. And that's the nuclear JCPOA agreement in 2015 and all aspects to that. When I was working in government, I had responsibility for non-proliferation and counterproliferation. Many of my colleagues, a number of my colleagues, were very instrumental in the drafting of the JCPOA, and many of them were surprised that I didn't support the JCPOA. And I tried to explain to them, and I'll explain it again today, why I didn't support that. As Alireza mentioned, I was a negotiator with North Korea for over 2 years, negotiating an agreement that we had in 2005, September 19, 2005. It took us 2.5 years, and what we demanded from North Korea, and we continue to demand, is complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of all nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons programs. The JCPOA, with its sunset clause and with other aspects to it, was so different. What we were telling Iran is, within 15 years, 2031, you can spin as many centrifuges as you want. You can enrich at any level you want. And as we knew, Iran pursued a nuclear weapons program prior to 2003. They were actively working on that program. And what that would mean in 20 to 31, what a message to the region if Iran has a nuclear weapon. And we say that with North Korea. South Korea, Japan, and others would pursue their own nuclear weapons programs if they do not dismantle. Well, the same with Iran. If Iran should pursue nuclear weapons, we should be very mindful of the fact, regardless of any US extended nuclear deterrence commitments, countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Egypt, they will pursue a nuclear weapons capability. So that is a threat by definition. So what I saw in the JCPOA was a sunset clause that said in 15 years, you can enrich at any level. And in 10 years, you can build more sophisticated, and Ali just mentioned the sophisticated the centrifuges that are available, the R2s, et cetera, which would spin that much faster, which means they could move that much quicker towards a nuclear weapon. So by definition, I had problems with the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. But I was told something else. This will be transformational. This would transform Iran's behavior, and they will become a legitimate stakeholder, and they'll behave, and there'll be good behavior. Well, Undersecretary Rood just made a very strong case for that not happening, because immediately after 2015, and immediately after the monies were made available, that monies that were frozen, but some of the other money that was made available to the regime, their military budgets increased and their activities became that much more potent. Whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's the militias, the Shia militias in Iraq, whether it's their activities in Syria, I can go down the whole list that Undersecretary Rood spoke about so eloquently. They didn't change. This wasn't transformation in a positive way. It was transformation in a negative way. They felt more, the sense, at least I had, they felt more emboldened that they could be more active, and they used the IRGC and the Quds Force in a very aggressive manner, in a very blatant manner. So you have to wonder about that. Now, it was mentioned a few minutes ago about the arms embargo that will be lifted in October. And we haven't talked about missiles. Well, missiles are an issue that we have followed very closely with Iran. One of the reasons is because they've worked very closely with North Korea, getting a lot of missile technology from North Korea, the Taepodong 2 specifically. So when you look at the Shahab 3, the Shahab 5, the Shahab 6, and when you look at the commitments made by the Supreme Leader that we will not have anything that goes beyond 2,000 kilometers, you have to question that, because they're working on missile capabilities that reach the whole of Western Europe and eventually the United States. That's powerful. And when the arms embargo is lifted, they will have access to components that would enhance the capabilities to permit those missiles to have greater reach. And with greater reach, also to deliver a nuclear weapon. So briefly, the JCPOA, in my estimation, was a path for Iran to eventually pursue nuclear weapons. They can, and regardless of what and Oli, you made a very impassioned case and a persuasive case that the IAEA and the monitors have never been given the access in Iran that would be required for a country that wanted to be very open and transparent about their programs. When they walked away from developing a nuclear weapon in 2003, then why not be transparent? Well, the monitors have always had problems getting in. And when we looked at this, whether it was Natanz to begin with, whether it was Fordow, whether it was other facilities, Pachin, whatever it was, they've always had problems. So ladies and gentlemen, briefly stated, Iran's behavior has been an issue of real concern, not only to the people of Iran, and we see what's happening with the Green Revolution going back to 2009, and even most recently, but also to the region and beyond the region, eventually on that. So we have to be mindful of that. And you, again, with the IRGC and the Quds Force, and again, even something very recent, the Ukrainian civilian aircraft that was shot down. And the initial reaction from the regime was what? We didn't do it? Oh, then eventually when it became overly persuasive and when the evidence was very obvious, yes, we did. Are we just going to move in this direction? Are we just going to be that naive? So when Undersecretary Rood talks about maximum pressure, that's where we are now. And until Iran, in my estimation, the regime shows their behavior is changing and they're not causing regional havoc with the IRGC and the Quds Force, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's Gaza Strip, whatever, or whether it's certainly in Syria or in Iraq. And they're more overt with not only their nuclear programs, but their missile programs and where they're going. I think we have to keep the pressure on this regime. understanding that the people of Iran we care about. And that's important. But the regime has to understand they have to be responsive to the people of Iran. And we would always be supportive of the people of Iran, but not a regime that exploits the people. And that is adventuresome in their region and a threat to the region and eventually to the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. You certainly said it all. You said the JCPOA was a path to the bomb, and said that the whole idea was that this was this is going to be transforming the behavior of the Iran regime. And from what we've heard from the panel today and the realities on the ground, it's been exactly the other way around. The Iran regime's rogue behaviors have worsened externally, but also repression against their own population has actually increased. Now, with that, I'd like to go to Bob. Ambassador Joseph, as I said, he served both in the State Department, the White House, the Department of Defense, and he has tremendous experience about the whole situation. I'm sure he can add a lot more to all the other problems by the Iran regime. But let's talk about the solution, the prospects for change, what's really happening within Iran, but also generally speaking, what should really the US do to once and for all eliminate the threat of the Iranian regime? Bob, please.
Good morning, Alireza. Let me also thank you and the other organizers of this event for the invitation to participate as a member of the panel. It's always a privilege to collaborate with such distinguished and dedicated professionals. As you all know, we are in a situation really of unprecedented simultaneous crises. A cruel pandemic, a massive economic dislocation, and civil disorder unmatched for over 50 years. While we work to overcome these ongoing multiple challenges, it's absolutely essential that we also keep our eye on the national security threats from foreign adversaries that continue to face our nation. The leaders of China, of Russia, North Korea, likely believing that the United States is distracted by internal weaknesses, are all taking actions to consolidate their power internally and expand their influence and presence externally. And there should be no doubt that the opportunistic mullahs in Tehran will also seek to take advantage of these tragic times. To, in the words of Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think John and Joe have done a truly excellent job in describing the many threats from Iran: regional aggression and internal interference against its neighbors, including key US allies, support for international terrorism, the use of proxy forces in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, and elsewhere, and its buildup of military capabilities to threaten and to coerce, especially its ballistic missile arsenal. And Olli, as always, has done a good job making clear that the regime's nuclear program, nuclear weapons program, continues to be a major concern that could quickly change. And the political and military dynamic in the region and beyond could be affected in moments. What I'd like to do is briefly talk about what we should do to meet the full spectrum of threats posed by Iran. And consistent with Alireza's opening remarks, as well as some of the comments by the other panelists, I think it's useful, in fact, I think it's essential to distinguish between the regime and the Iranian people. After all, the people of Iran are the first and foremost victims of this regime. They have suffered through over 40 years of brutal repression, including mass executions, more accurately called mass murders, of more than 100,000 of their citizens. In the last year alone, thousands have been gunned down in the streets or imprisoned when they dared to seek democracy and an end to the endemic corruption and pervasive incompetence of a regime that has failed its own people wherever and whenever in need, whether from massive floods or from the coronavirus, which is an ongoing human tragedy that has taken the lives of tens of thousands, made much worse by leaders who siphon off the wealth of the nation for their own personal gain. This is a regime that has lost all legitimacy. It can stay in power only through brute force and the denial of the aspirations of the people for freedom and for democracy. And here, I would say, is the first action that the US can and should take. And that is speaking up for the rights of the Iranian people to determine their own future. We know that President Reagan's public emphasis on human rights gave comfort and hope to the people of the Soviet Union and to those people in the captured states of Eastern and Central Europe. It was a major factor in the demise of Soviet tyranny. President Trump, in stark contrast to his immediate predecessor, has made public statements in support of the Iranian people. For example, telling the rulers in Tehran not to kill those protesting in the streets, an important message that may help to deter in the future those who are afraid that they may be held accountable for their actions. But the president has also made clear that he rejects a policy of regime change. As I understand his position, it means rejection of the use of American military force to overthrow the regime. And I must say on this, I agree 100% with the president. We should not go to war to bring down the current religious dictatorship, but we don't need to. And as far as I know, no one, at least no serious individual, is advocating that we do so. Regime change must come from within, from the people of Iran. We can and we should help to accomplish this goal through moral support and through the policy of maximum pressure, but it is on the Iranian people to determine their own future. It is their future to be determined by their efforts and by their sacrifices, and they know it. Without invasion or war, we can still do more to aid regime collapse, which is a term used by my colleague, Mike Makovsky. This can begin with a consistent message of support for the people. While the president's remarks have been direct and sound, he has been undercut by other governmental institutions. One prime example is the Voice of America, which, still operated by individuals from the previous administration, has continued to reflect the past policy of appeasement toward the regime. In fact, the bias is so blatant that Brian Hook, the special envoy for Iran and the head of the efforts to apply maximum pressure on the regime, has referred to VOA Persian as the voice of the mullahs, passing on Iranian disinformation and propaganda and hiding the many sins of the regime against its own people. This will only end with new leadership at VOA, one that supports the pro-democracy opposition, such as your organization, the NCRI, inside and outside of Iran. Equally important as what we say in our messaging are the actions we are taking to pressure the regime to change its behavior, as Secretary Pompeo outlined in his May 2018 speech at the Heritage Foundation. Here we must employ all tools of statecraft, which for the most part are being applied by the Trump administration, and quite well, I would add. Diplomacy should be directed at isolating, not appeasing the regime. Opting out of the JCPOA was a major blow to the mullahs' agenda. This fundamentally flawed nuclear agreement not only failed to close off Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon, as Olli and others have mentioned today, it paved the way for a future nuclear-armed Iran. In the interim, it provided the regime with billions of dollars that they have used to expand their regional aggression, their support for their terrorist allies, and to oppress their own citizens. Other diplomatic measures, and here I would mention such things as the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization, have also added to the pressure on regime leaders. These designations should be expanded to include other bad actors, such as the MOIS, whose agents have orchestrated terrorist plots in Europe and around the globe. Economic tools, such as trade sanctions and secondary sanctions, and cutting Iran off from the international financial network, are currently being effectively employed and should be expanded. Further cuts to Iran's oil exports should be pursued, as should denial of access to advanced technologies that can be used to further domestic oppression and external aggression. And most important, as John and others have pointed out, it is essential that the UN mandated arms embargo, currently scheduled to end in October, be extended indefinitely. If that fails due to a veto cast in the Security Council, I would hope that the US would trigger the snapback provisions to reinstate sanctions in light of Iran's violations of the JCPOA, as both Olli and Joe have spoken to. President Rouhani has said that regaining access to the international arms market would prove, and I quote, a huge political success. And he's right. It would be a huge success for this regime. But Iran must be denied that success for the sake of peace in the region. Militarily, the United States and our allies must ensure the presence of adequate force to deter Iranian aggression and defeat any substantial military moves by the regime. The president has made clear that he will order a forceful response to significant provocations by the regime. Unlike the red lines of the previous administration, this one must be enforced if the line is crossed. The US reputation still suffers from the failure to take meaningful action against Assad in Syria for his use of chemical weapons against his own people. Again, this is not a recommendation to initiate conflict or to go to war. That is a red herring that's used by the regime and by its stooges, those who Lenin today would call useful idiots. But strength is the best means to deter war. We have seen over and over in 2003 and most recently with the killing of Soleimani that the best means to back this regime down is to take forceful action, to stand against aggression by showing both our capability and our resolve. We must be prepared to do this for as long as it takes for the regime to rot from within and for the Iranian people to prevail in their long and determined quest for democracy. I could go on and on, but I'll stop there. I know the audience is waiting to ask questions and hear again from the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bob. You certainly gave a good policy options for the United States, and you summed it up at the end by saying standing against the aggression of the Iran regime in every aspect of it, and at the same time standing on the side of the people and the pro-democracy movement. That's really what it takes to bring about change without boots on the ground. Now, I want to ask the journalists and the media who are here to please feel free to write your questions, the Q&A. You can also raise your hand. But I have a couple of quick questions myself before we go to the journalists. First, you know, Undersecretary Rood, you mentioned the elimination of Qasem Soleimani. Certainly that was really significant given the role that Qasem Soleimani played within the regime. He was practically the #2 in the regime, not just for the external rogue behavior and terrorism of the Iran regime, but just like keeping the regime in balance. And he was also involved in the repression inside the country during the putting down the protests and everything. And his successor, Ismail Qaani, clearly is no Soleimani, and definitely that was a big blow. But in terms of like making a decision to, you know, take out Soleimani, I don't know like what was involved in that, and what were the expectations, whether in terms of the reaction of the Iranian regime, did you expect, you know, a stronger reaction from the Iranian regime, or what was really going on in terms of that decision making, to the extent that you can share with our audience? We need to unmute John, please.
There we are.
Yes.
Yes, certainly the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani was a very big signal to the Iranian regime. And beyond the immediate effect that obviously removing from capability one of the most talented people that the regime had employed throughout the region. I'd spoken in my remarks about the fact that over an 8-year period, over 600 American personnel were killed through operations that Qasem Soleimani led to provide Iranian munitions, advanced munitions to Shia militia groups in Iraq. course, he played a critical role elsewhere around the whole region in creating these proxy forces and supporting these terrorist groups. And as you mentioned, was willing, when called upon or at his instigation, many times he volunteered, to use the same kind of tactics at home against the Iranian people to suppress dissent and to use violence where necessary. And so removing from the capability that the Supreme Leader had, this very talented individual, this leader of the efforts across the region, was really something that was critical. It's not a decision taken lightly, and as has been discussed previously publicly, President Trump made that decision ultimately in our system. That those decisions are made by the president, and it was intended to deter future Iranian aggression. There had come a time where there was an escalating series of attacks by Shia militia groups supported by the Iranian regime inside Iraq that had killed U.S. soldiers again. And it simply became time to send a message to try to restore the deterrence that had been frayed against these more aggressive actions that the regime was taking. And so that's the hope on those things. Now, with respect to retaliation, I think clearly we did expect the regime would retaliate, and they did. I think there was like many times during a conflict, sometimes the perceptions or the reporting is not very accurate. And I saw that some suggestion the Iranian government tried not to cause casualties or didn't really mean to strike the American bases. That is not the conclusion I drew. Frankly, I drew the opposite conclusion. These were strikes intended to kill and wound those that were in the proximity and destroy military capabilities. That's been stated by others in the government, but I personally have reviewed the information, and that's my conclusion as well. It was only because of the strong training and good actions that U.S. military commanders on the ground took to disperse forces, to put them in protected areas, that we didn't see more casualties or a lot of people killed in those strikes. And so certainly, I think, though, has sent a powerful message about U.S. resolve in the region, a powerful message about these kinds of aggressive actions that inflict deaths and wound others, including American service members in the region, just simply not going to be tolerated by the administration and the government in the United States. So hopefully we will see a restoration, this restoration of deterrence continue to hold, but it's a tough situation that's always dynamic and always requires careful attention.
Thank you so much, John. That was a very thorough response. Appreciate that. Now, I want to ask a question from Oli. One of the two pathways to fissile material was actually the heavy weather facility in Iraq. And under the JCPOA agreement, the regime had agreed to irreversibly bring down the plutonium capability of Iraq. But, some 5 years later, that seems not to be the case. What I want to do is I want to play a very brief video clip of Jafarzadeh, who's the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, that specifically talks about that. The interview was on Iranian television. It's in Farsi, but it has an English subtitle. And then I want to get the reaction of Oli on that. Please play the tape.
اما متاسفانه الان 3 ساله هر چی میگیم آقا ما در چاله ریاکتور آب سنگین عراق سیمان نریختیم، اگر ریخته بودیم که دیگه ریاکتور عراق از بین میرفت.
توجه ولی گفتید تو لوله هاش ریختین.
تو لوله های اینجا توی اون کالاندریایی که داشتیم در آوردیم. اون کالاندریا چیه؟ یه سری لوله است که سوختا میره تو اون لوله. ما مشابه اون لوله ها هم خریده بودیم، ولی من اون زمان نمیتونستم اعلام بکنم. فقط 1 نفر در ایران میدونست.
درسته.
و حالا بالاترین مقام ارشد نظام گفتیم کسی دیگه نمیدونست. ما برای این که وقتی که مذاکره میکردن دوستان میدونستیم که اینا بالاخره بد عهدی میکنن، بد قولی میکنن. حضرت آقا فرموده بودن که مواظب باشید اینا بد عهدن، بد قولن. خب ما بایستی با یه فراستی، با یه هوشمندی کارمون انجام میدادیم. یعنی علاوه بر این که پل‌های پشت سرمون رو خراب نمیکردیم، پل هم میساختیم که اگر قرار بود برگردیم سریعتر برگردیم. خب ما یه سری لوله بوده، یه لوله هایی که مثلا به قطر 2-3 سانت به طول 3-4 متر خب مجسم کنید این لوله ها رو که یه سر داره یه ته. ما مشابه اون لوله ها رو هم خریده بودیم به همون تعداد. اون لوله ها رو گفتن توش سیمان بریزید. خب ما اون لوله ها رو ریختیم.
Okay, okay, Oli, you saw what Ali Akbari Saleh, he said. He talked about the not, destroying the bridges behind him, but also building more bridges, talking about the JCPOA. Please give us your assessment of what Saleh is actually talking about.
First of all, I would like to point out that now people understand why Mr. Saleh and Mr. Zarif were heroes when they returned back to home. Because as Joe said on the sunset provisions, that really the sun really doesn't set, but the enrichment program will prevail. To great extent, this is also valid for the heavy water program, the program which could produce weapons-grade plutonium if Iran so wants. We just saw one example there. Iran maintained these vitally important parts of the construction of the core aside, the excess ones, which were not covered by the JCPOA. This is one of the technical flaws of the agreement reached. But there is actually another one which is of equal concern. This reactor has a reactor power of 40 megawatts in its original size. And in order to reduce the plutonium production capability, the JCPOA partners agreed with Iran that it will be redesigned in such a way that this power will be less than 20 megawatt, so it will not produce substantial amount of plutonium. And at the same time, they change also fuel enrichment to another one, which also reduces it. But that's not the full story. Last December, there was an inauguration of the secondary cooling circuit of this reactor. It appears to me that that secondary cooling circuit is built to the old specifications, 40 megawatts, not 20. Which in very simple terms means that if Iran wants to go back to the original reactor size, like now it might be very attractive because of this ending of the waivers for the time being and the redesign has stopped, they can go and build it as it was without any big difficulties. Half of it is already done, the secondary cooling circuit, and what they need to do is to build a new calandria from those pipes and finish the core. But what is another flaw on the JCPOA? If you read the IAEA report since January 2016, they say there has been no construction at the heavy water reactor in Iraq. That's not true. Iran has building the rest of the reactor with the exception of the core, and is ready to go, is slowly dressing up and ready to go. And why is IAEA not doing its job? Actually, it probably would like to do, but there seems to be a side deal between the JCPOA partners that the IAEA only reports about that core part and not the full reactor, which actually contravenes the safeguards practices of the IAEA. Because any reactor which has power that more than 25 megawatts requires, according to the IAEA verification practices, very different safeguards arrangements. And this reactor, if it maintains the 40 megawatt secondary cooling, should be subject to those measures. So we have here several problems at the same time. And now it's important, if this reactor is going to be the process continue, that the JCPOA parties clearly demonstrate to the international community that the reactor really meets this requirement, small production of plutonium, not numbers which were before, and the design has been done in such a way that it becomes extremely difficult to modify the reactor for the original purpose.
Thank you so much, Oli. Let me just, there's one question coming from Sangmin Lee of the Radio Free Asia. He's asking, I guess that question is for Ambassador DeTrani. He's asking, what's the update of Iran and North Korea connection? Does Iran still continue to cooperate with North Korea about the missile technology, and as North Korea has actually developed new missiles? Joe, you want to respond to that question, please?
Very briefly, yes, Iran and North Korea continue to have a very close working relationship. I think diplomatically they're very close. I think on the question of missile technology, there's no question about that the North Koreans are providing whatever assistance. And as we've seen, North Korea is rather sophisticated with what they've been doing with their Hwasong 14 and Hwasong 15, building an intercontinental ballistic missile capability. There's no doubt that there is missile technology cooperation going on between North Korea and Iran. So yes, to answer to the question is that relationship continues as it was in the past, but I think it's even been enhanced on the question, indeed, on the issue of missile technology.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. I think there's another question actually from Andrew Lawton from True North. He says, could the panelists please comment on the US decision to end the sanctions, the waiver for companies working at Iranian nuclear sites, because European nations have criticized this move as hindering efforts to denuclearize Iran? And maybe Bob, you want to take that question? You need to unmute Bob, please. Yes, Bob, you're unmuted, please.
I would be happy to, but I think Olli and Joe are probably more capable to take that question. Let me just say, though, that the regime has a pattern of playing games. They have, as you mentioned earlier, sought to use the COVID crisis, the coronavirus crisis, as a means to relieve sanctions. I think this falls in that category. The problem truly stems, I think, from what was negotiated in the context of the JCPOA. You played that video, and I think if you go back and you look at that video and you ask yourself, how could we truly negotiate with this regime if this is the type of measures that they take in secret while you're under while negotiations are ongoing? It's foolish to think that you can have an agreement with this regime because of the very nature of the regime. I mean, you can have an agreement, but you can't have a sound agreement. And I think that's been borne out. I had testified against the JCPOA, both in the House and Senate back in 2015. And I think that the criticisms and my assessment continues to hold. This is not because my crystal ball is any better than anyone else's, but it is, I think, attributable to the fact that I start with a very realistic understanding of this regime, and a regime that will do anything to stay in power at the expense of its own people. This is not brain surgery. Again, just look at that video. And I think that, I thought then, and I still think now, that this is sort of that it's just delusional to believe that the regime can reform, or that given more time and given more resources, its leaders will become more moderate. And as Joe pointed out, that was how the JCPOA was sold. And now we're living with the consequences.
Great. Any other members of the panel would want to weigh in on this particular question?
May I say a couple of words? So
yes, please. Yeah, you're on now.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that this ending of the waivers is a little bit mixed bag. First of all, there's no immediate concern from the Iranian point of view if the fuel deliveries for Tehran research reactor are stopped, because they have themselves said, Mr. Kamalvandi, in several occasions, that they have enough fuel for years to come. So this is just perhaps a small hiccup in the process. Then the other thing is, you heard what I said about problems with the Arak reactor and redesign. I think it's a time for time out and look what this China and Iran and the UK are now doing together to make sure that this reactor really is designed to produce neutrons, do the neutron physics, and not to produce substantial amount of plutonium. The facts which are out there show that perhaps they have not fully achieved that goal, that this is entirely peaceful. Then export of spent fuel. Well, actually, I don't see to stop export of spent fuel from Iran as long as it goes to a proper place like, let's say, Russia. I think that the fuel from Bushehr power reactors should be appropriated should be sent back to the home in due course. But there is also other fuel which one should consider. And this is the fairly large stock of enriched uranium at the Tehran research reactor. It's enriched. There is even high enriched US origin fuel, few kilograms sitting in Tehran. There's no need for Iran to have that 50% enriched fuel there. Same is valid with this couple of 100 kilograms or slightly more than 100 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium, which has been burning there since early 1990s. It still has 10% uranium in the spent fuel or even more. So these quantities should be repatriated. So this is my view on this ending of sanctions. So there is still some thinking to be done.
Great, thank you so much, Oli. I know we have a lot more to talk about, and we're sorry for the journalists if we couldn't address all of their questions. We've gone a little bit over our time, but I just want to wrap up the panel today. You heard very eloquently from the members of the panel who highlighted the threat coming from the Iranian regime, from John Rood to Joe DeTrani to Ambassador Bob Joseph, and the nuclear side of it from Dr. Heinonen. You also heard about the great potential for change inside the country, and also the in terms of what really needs to be done to deal with that problem. I think what we saw during the uprisings in 2017, 2018, 2019, and most recently in January 2020, the people of Iran have spoken already very loudly and clearly, and paid a high price for that. And John mentioned the 1,500 people who were killed in Iran during just the recent November protests. And so many people have been arrested and jailed and tortured. So that's a great sentiment on the part of the people of Iran who reject this regime in its entirety. And the fact that COVID-19 has entered the scene hasn't really changed anything in favor of the Ayatollahs or against regime change. To the contrary, it's become a point of diminishing return for the Ayatollahs, and the exploitation of the COVID-19 is not working, and COVID-19 itself has become one additional reason for the people of Iran to want to get rid of the Ayatollahs. And recently, in the midst of the pandemic, the supreme leader and other officials of the regime have repeatedly talked about the survival of the regime. Every time, he talks, he's warning everyone about the threat that is posing the regime, and that's the reigniting of the uprising by the people against the Iran regime. He warned about the network inside Iran of the main Iranian opposition, the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK. And in just, last week, he again mentioned that, saying, beware of them. They are the ones who want to undermine the system and overthrow the regime. And the regime has gone to wage terror against the, dissidents, and, Bob Joseph mentioned that. But just think about it. Only in the past 2 years, there were 7 so-called diplomats of the Iran regime, which were expelled by the European nations. Another one is now in jail in Brussels for physically carrying the bomb to detonate against the rally of the Iranian resistance, where 100,000 people were there, and some of the members of the panel were also there, and Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, the president of the resistance, was speaking there, and a number of others were arrested. And also there were 2 Minister of Intelligence agents who were arrested right here in the United States for spying on us, as part of, based on the criminal complaint filed by the Justice Department, that they had a plan, what they call capture and kill operations. They confessed to it. They're now in jail. And there are a total of 10 Iran regime officials who were expelled or in jail for terror plots. And out of these 10, 8 of them were tied to plots against us, against this movement. And I think that's a clear indication where the regime feels the threat is coming from and where the focus of the regime should be. Last month, the regime arrested 2 young Iranian students at the Sharif University of Technology. And these were elite award-winning students. And, Sharif University of Technology is known as the MIT of Iran. And those students were accused of being connected to the MEK, that they were involved in the uprisings. They were part of the resistance units of the MEK and all of that. And there were 18 other people who were arrested and charged with, similar charges. This is a clear indication that, where the concern of the Iran regime is. They're thinking 24/7, not to help the people, not to overcome the pandemic, not to, cut their funds for mercenaries there, but just to keep the regime in power. So, having said that, I think the uprising showed the world that this regime is very vulnerable. They're not 10 feet tall. I remember all the dictators seem to be invincible until they fall. And the Iran regime is no exception. So what the US has done most recently in building pressure on the Iran regime, the maximum pressure policy has worked. It has further weakened the regime, and we saw some of the actions that the US has taken. And John mentioned the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, the sanctions that were imposed, the designation of the IRGC, and all the other actions. These are things that matter a lot to the Iranian regime, but also sends a signal to the people of Iran that this is not, business as usual. This is not the era dating back to a decade ago where the Iranian regime would get away with anything and suppress the protests and the population and just get rewarded internationally with cash and agreements and so on. So,
Alireza?
Yes, please go ahead, Bob.
Could I just follow that up with just a brief comment?
Please, yes, please.
As you know, I had the opportunity to visit Camp Ashraf in Albania last year. I took away a good number of observations because the visit was both moving and it was instructive. Let me give you just 2 observations that I think are relevant to what you're saying. The first is that if you go to the camp and you talk to the residents, you can feel the commitment, you can feel the spirit, the dedication of these people to achieve a free Iran. The spirit I found to be truly amazing because it was positive and it was optimistic. It wasn't regretful or revengeful. And these are people who have suffered at the hands of the regime, people who have lost their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters. And yet they're so dedicated to bringing democracy and freedom to Iran that it's truly, truly moving. My second observation is I also had the opportunity to witness some concrete things that those residents are doing to achieve the goal of a free Iran. For example, reaching out to the people of Iran with a message of hope, with the message of truth. And also activities that relate to the organization of the resistance inside Iran. And I think the MEK has been key to the resistance really across the nation. And when you visit the camp, when you look at what they're doing, when you feel the spirit of these people, there is no doubt why the regime brands the NCRI-MEK as public enemy #1. And to me, that's a badge of honor.
Great. You're absolutely correct, Bob. I think you summed it up the best way, that there is a solution to overcome all of the rogue behavior of the Iranian regime, because this has been going on for 40 years. And the regime is not going to change its behavior on its own. Rather, we need to change it. We, meaning the people of Iran, are determined to change this regime. And now there's really a tremendous opportunity because the regime has never been so weak as they are now. The population have never been this determined to bring about change. As you saw, the risk they took, the price they paid in the streets of Tehran and over 250 cities across the country. And the fact that the international community is not playing the game of the Ayatollahs, especially the United States, and they're just putting facts on the ground and just dealing with the facts rather than illusions. So that makes a huge difference. And for that, I think the real solution at the end of the day, while we have to focus right now on the maximum pressure, the snapback at the UN Security Council, bringing all of those resolutions and sanctions back. That has been the position of the Iranian resistance since day one. But the ultimate solution, we should be reminded, that is regime change by the people of Iran, and US and other countries can definitely play a big role. And just think about it. I want to close the panel by thinking about what a difference it would make if you have a republic Iran that is free, secular, non-nuclear, is not aggressive against its neighbors, is not interfering in the affairs of others, and is just like, using all of the resources of the country to moving the country forward and building friendship with the neighboring countries. It will just change the entire equation in the region. And all of those militia groups, all of those Islamists, as John was elaborating earlier, they will lose their backing, their resources, and they will eventually fade away because Iran, instead of being the epicenter of terror and violence and instability, will become the center of hope and prosperity and building friendship in the region. With that, I'd like to thank every single member of our panel. I thank Undersecretary John Rood, really appreciate that. And I think this was probably one of the first events that you talked about Iran, if not first, since you left the administration in the, at the end of February. And I want to thank Ambassador Bob Joseph, Ambassador Joe DeTrani, and Dr. Oli Heinonen. We're definitely going to have similar events coming soon in every 2-3 weeks. And please check our website, www.ncri-US.org, or follow us on our social media tools at NCRI-US. to get updates for that. With that, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank all the viewers who've spent their time. I want to thank the journalists who asked their questions and apologize for those who we couldn't get to their questions. And I want to wish everyone good health and happy day today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.